Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History with Mr. Ansharsky. This is Unit 4 still, Chapter 6 now. And in Chapter 6 and 7, we're going to deal with societies in East Asia. We're going to look at Japan first today, and then in our next video, we're going to look at China. And a lot of the information I'm about to say today is mostly actually kind of stuff that is more relevant to Unit 3 in the sense that Unit 3 covers how do states, how do governments, how do societies centralize power. And we will look at that examples of that today. But the reason why I'm doing it in Unit 4 in particular is to demonstrate how European contact is increasing in Asia, as well as Africa and the Americas, as we explored in previous chapters. So today we are going to look at this idea of how do European societies impact Japanese developments. And that is indeed going to be the focus of today. So your bell work on the screen, identify a change in ocean-based trade after 1600. So come up with any examples of a change after 1600. And today we are going to look at reunification in Japanese history. We are going to pay attention to the idea of how does Japan become more centralized under a new system of government, under a new shogunate, under direction of the Tokugawa clan. All right. And we're going to do a little bit of a review of Japanese history just so we're up to speed with everything. But reunification makes the implication of disunity, of ununification, of disunification, whatever. So, yes, today we are going to continue this topic of how do states build up their governments? How do they expand in the period between 1450 and 1750? So yes, we are going to take a look at this idea of Japanese reunification. Some of these concepts are going to be relevant in the future, and it also does draw us back to the theme of Unit 3, that states are becoming more centralized in the period between 1450 and 1750. Generally, that is true. But before we look at how Japan is developing, we first got to look at what does Japan look like prior to the 1500s. And indeed, that is going to bring us to this particular slide right here. We are going to look at what does Japan look like prior to 1573, to be specific. Well, remember, Japan, for much of its history, is ruled over in a system of government known as a shogunate. And what exactly is a shogunate? Well, this is going to be where I demonstrate what that is and define what exactly a shogunate is. So a shogunate is a type of military government in which government, I should say, is largely ruled over by a figure known as a shogun. And a shogun is a military leader, essentially, who then divides land to his vassals, known as, in the case of Japan, the daimyos. And the daimyos are, in this case, Japanese warlords, Japanese nobles who own their own territory and, in theory, have to answer to the call of the shogun. And the daimyo, their power, their military force, comes through troops known as the samurai. And indeed, this is what we talked about back in Unit 1, actually, I think. But the samurai, they're the troops of the daimyo. And the daimyo raise their armies through the samurai. The samurai then fight for the daimyos, and the daimyos then use their troops to fight for the shogun. In theory, that's how Japanese feudalism works. That's how Japanese feudalism works in theory. However, the system of a shogunate, much like what we've talked about in the past, is very decentralized. Feudalism is a decentralized form of government. And indeed, that is what's going to characterize the Ashikaga shogunate. And the Ashikaga shogunate emerged, as you remember, to largely in response to attempts by the emperor to centralize power. The emperor is an important figure under the Japanese system of feudalism. But the Japanese emperor is more of what we would call a figurehead. A figurehead is someone who has cultural or religious power, but not necessarily political power. The former Queen of England, for example, in England, in the United Kingdom, modern day United Kingdom, is a figurehead or was a figurehead. She is dead now. That's for my Irish ancestors out there. Anyway, so we do see a decentralized form of government under the Ashikaga shogunate. The emperor does not have any political power. He is more of a cultural and religious figure. In Shintoism, the Japanese traditional religion, the emperor is someone of religious significance. They have some deification going on. They have some godlike status in Japanese society. So the emperor is there. It's just the shogun, the guy with all the military power. He is in charge of Japan. And he is in charge of dividing up Japan between his supporters, his daimyo. And the daimyo have their military control over their territory through samurai. So the Ashikaga shogunate is a time period of decentralization. The daimyo, they have a lot of local and regional influence. And because of that, sometimes they feel they don't need to listen to the shogun. And in fact, we do see a lot of competition within the system of Japanese feudalism. Japanese feudalism, this model in which daimyo are granted a lot of local privileges and power and military power, they're military warlords after all, they are going to compete with the other daimyo. There are hundreds, I think up to 300 different states in the Ashikaga shogunate. So it is very decentralized, and this actually leads to a lot of conflict between different daimyos in Japan. And in fact, we do see a period of internal conflict within Japan, different conflict between the different daimyos during a period of Japanese history known as the Sengoku period. The Sengoku period in general is a time of political disunity in Japanese history. But we also are going to see that this particular civil war, this particular period of political instability, is going to lead to the emergence of a family that will unify Japan and create a new, more centralized shogunate, the Tokugawa Shogunate. So let's look at that process. And for your Unit 4 test, you wouldn't need to know the specifics of who led who and who fought against who. No, you wouldn't necessarily need to know that. What you do need to know is how is Japan unified, by what by what military means is Japan unified, and the result. And the result, I'm just going to say right now, is the emergence of the Tokugawa clan as the new military leaders of Japan. All right, so let's take a little bit of a dive into Japanese history, and I'm going to mispronounce a lot of names in just a second. All right, so first we've got the rise of this particular daimyo during the Sengoku period, a daimyo from the clan of Oda by the name of Nobunaga. And for all my Japanese viewers out there, I am sorry for how I pronounce everything. That's true for literally every society in the world except the United States and Europe. Maybe I am white trash. Maybe I shouldn't be teaching world history. Anyway, let's look at Nobunaga. And Nobunaga is going to unify Japan mostly because he is going to purchase firearms from Europeans. So the unification of Hanshu by the Oda clan is going to happen through the use of European firearms. And Hanshu is the mainland of Japan. It's the primary and the biggest island in the Japanese archipelago. Archipelago. There we go. And an archipelago is a series of islands, basically. So we do see the unification of Japan. All of these different warring territories are going to fall under the reign of the Oda clan as a result of the use of European firearms. European firearms provide the edge needed to unify and take over the territory of rival daimyos. However, unfortunately, Nobunaga is going to be assassinated, unfortunately. And his assassination is going to lead to a succession crisis, as we're going to see in a second. However, the unification of Honshu and the other Japanese islands is going to be kind of something that happened as a result of the Oda clan's unification of Japan. So Japan is unified, but after the death of Nobunaga, we are going to see there will be internal competition for who will rule over this unified Japan. And we do see kind of that this conflict will spill over into East Asia, actually. We will see an attempt to centralize power will happen through the invasion of Korea and China. And we'll talk about the China impact more in our next presentation. But essentially, after the death of Nobunaga, we are going to have this succession crisis. Who is going to be the next shogun that will rule over this unified territory? And five guys emerge. The most important is this man in the corner right here, Tokugawa Ieyasu. There we go. That's how I'm pronouncing it. So we are going to see that the specific clan will win this succession crisis, and Tokugawa's clan is going to be the ruling shogun. So we do see a new shogunate in Japanese history led by the Tokugawa clan. Awesome. And the Tokugawa shogunate, that's really what we are building up to. This is the meat and potatoes of today's presentation. And the Tokugawa shogunate is going to be, as we'll see in future units, the last shogunate. So last time Japan is ruled over by a military leader known as a shogun. And we are going to see the shogunate will introduce a period of centralization. It still will utilize the model of feudalism. There still is less power for the emperor, but it is, by comparison to earlier periods, a period of political unity, a period of political centralization. But as we're going to see later on, this period of centralization is going to be strengthened through practices of isolationism. And isolationism, as we've mentioned in previous chapters, is the idea of restricting outside presence in a specific country, of rejecting outside influences and focusing on internal matters. And the Tokugawa shogunate is going to centralize power through that means, as we're going to see in a second. But there are other ways that the Tokugawa shogunate is going to centralize power. By 1603, the Tokugawa clan is going to claim they are the shogunate. They are going to achieve cultural legitimacy by asking permission by the emperor to rule as shogun. And really, it's kind of a unequal relationship in many ways. The emperor can't really say no. So it's more that the Tokugawa clan is seeking approval and cultural legitimacy to rule over Japan. So we see that kind of centralization can occur through cultural legitimacy, and that's what's happening with being formally appointed by the emperor in Japan. But there are other means by which the Tokugawa shogunate will centralize their power. For one thing, they are going to heavily regulate the different daimyos, the different regional warlords, and decrease their political influence. We are going to see that under the Tokugawa shogunate, the Sengoku period ends, so we have no more internal civil wars. We have no internal conflicts. So the unification of the Japanese mainland, the invasion of other islands in the Japanese archipelago is going to occur under the shogunate of the Tokugawa clan. But we generally do see a decrease in the influence of regional warlords, of the daimyos. And the daimyos do still exist. They still do exist under the Tokugawa Shogunate. However, we do see that their military power is heavily restricted. Guns and swords are all locked up and distributed by the Tokugawa family. So we do see a consolidation of power, a decrease in the influence of daimyos. We see that one in how the military power is basically kind of regulated and handed out during times of crisis, during times when the Tokugawa family deems it necessary to grant military power to the daimyos. So we do kind of see that feudalism will continue, but the influence of the daimyos will decrease. And we actually do see this further centralization, further taking away of nobility power by moving the capital to the city of Edo, which will eventually become the city of Tokyo. And in Tokyo, this is where the Tokugawa clan is going to rule from as the shoguns of Japan. And the Tokugawa clan, they are going to build massive palaces. You can see an example right here in the city of Edo, but they're also going to kind of keep a close eye on the Japanese nobility, on the Japanese daimyos. They're going to have this policy known as alternate attendance, where essentially the daimyos have to live in the Tokugawa's palace some months of the year. It is a policy by which you can observe the influence of the daimyos. You can kind of regulate where they're going, basically. If they're having to live in the palace for certain months of the year, they're not going to be out there raising an army, basically. So we do see that this is a way to take away power from the daimyos. It is an example of how states are centralizing power in the period between 1450 and 1750. All right. So there's a few ways of centralization right there. We have this cultural legitimacy through getting approval by the emperor. We have this military kind of unification. We are the biggest military. We've unified the mainland. We've unified the different islands. We've seized power from the daimyos. We've given land to the loyal ones, but we've heavily restricted their military capacity. We control the firearms, we control the swords, we grant them out as we see fit, we being the Tokugawa Shogunate. And there's also this alternate attendance as well. So what's the impact of all of this? Well, there are a few impacts. This centralization is going to lead to political stability. There's no more internal conflicts, no more civil wars. Yay! And the impact of the no more civil wars idea is the idea that now there's no longer conflict, we can increase Japan's population. And Japan's population does greatly increase as a result of a return to political stability and centralization. Less wars means more time for farming, means more time for food, means more time for people and baby making, etc. So an increased population will occur as a result of centralization and political unity. But we also see this idea that peace will bring artistic development as well. We see a flourishing of arts under the Tokugawa Shogunate. We also see that the Tokugawa Shogunate will kind of sponsor different cultural and artistic movements. Not only does the shogunate do this, but also, of course, the emperor as well. The imperial family really don't have any power other than cultural legitimacy. So we do see a flourishing of the arts. We see the development of a type of theater known as kabuki. And kabuki theater is something that still exists in Japan today, but it is going to be developed during this time of cultural and artistic development. All right, so there's that going on in Japan. However, what else do we see? Well, another way that the Japanese are going to centralize authority is by creating a legal and social system based on Confucianism. And indeed, we are going to see that the adoption of a Confucian social hierarchy is another way to maintain power in Japan. Confucianism, as you might remember from our discussions of China, is this philosophical concept of a social hierarchy. That's one component of Confucianism. The idea that there are social superiors and that there needs to be a system of respect to one's elders, to one's social betters. And we do see the emergence of a class hierarchy based on Confucianism. And hierarchies in general are designed by elites to maintain political control over their society. So we do see a hierarchy emerge in which we are going to have daimyos and the shogun and the samurai. They tend to be on top. The shogun, of course, the dominant one. He technically is under the emperor, but the emperor, again, only a religious and cultural figure at this point. It's the shogun, then it's the daimyos, then it's the samurai, then it's peasants, then it's disgusting, filthy merchants. Merchants are at the bottom of generally any Confucian society. And we'll look at how that leads to conflict in just a second. So you should be able to identify how Japan was reunified, through what means was Japanese unification achieved, and how was it strengthened. You could also talk about that, but also what were some of the results on Japanese society. So look at those results right there. But the real connection to what we've discussed in Unit 4 is going to come through how does the Tokugawa Shogunate centralize power through foreign policy? And we're going to look at how that develops thanks to connections between Europeans and Japanese people. And give me 1 second because I need to blow my nose. But look at this wonderful piece of Japanese art. And I want you to think about, what does this say about European and Japanese connections in the time period we are discussing? Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. Mr. Ansharsky's role will be filled by his understudy, Mr. Ansharsky. All right. So let's go ahead and look at how Europe is creating contact with Japan, and then we're going to look at how that contact will change Japanese society. So really, when did Europeans come into Japan? Well, actually, we can trace that back to the Sengoku period, that period of political disunity. It's a time of civil war, civil conflict. There's no centralized state to resist European presence in Japan. And we do see that the first contact with Japanese and European societies is going to come through contact with the Portuguese. Indeed, in the 1500s, during the Age of Exploration, we are going to see the beginning of more permanent maritime contact between the Europeans and Japan as a result of Portuguese exploration. I think there's actually a shipwreck that the Portuguese, they got wrecked off the coast of Japan, and then thankfully they could come ashore to Japan and make it back to Europe somehow. Anyway, but we are going to see that after this initial kind of contact is established, we do see that Japan is going to become a center for what Europeans, a center for European interest in trade. We do see that this period of political disunity, there is no centralized government to expel Europeans just yet. And this is a time period where Europeans are going to try and get their foot in the door in Japan. And really, how are Europeans going to try and do this? Well, they're going to try and do this not only by establishing trade connections, by creating a market for European goods in Japan, but also culturally as well, in order to kind of butter up Japanese elites, you could say. We do see that countries like Spain and Portugal are going to send Jesuits. They're going to send Catholic missionaries to Japan. And these Catholic missionaries are kind of designed in a way to get Japanese elites more accustomed to European fashion, European styles of culture, European religion, European economic interest, especially. So we do see Jesuits going to Japan, guys like Francis Xavier. Francis Xavier was a prominent Jesuit missionary. I believe he was also in the Americas as well, but he's going to be sent to Japan, actually. He's one example of several Jesuit missionaries in Japan. And this generally kind of what Jesuits do. They're not only there to spread Catholicism, to find out mythical Christian kings in Asia, but also are there to kind of get Japanese elites, get Asian and African elites as well, more accustomed to Europeans. And we're going to look at how Japan reacts to this in just a second. But we do see the creation of a trading relation between Japan and European states. Japan is really interested in Western clothing, in Western technology, in Western fashion. So there is actually an interest by Japanese elites for Western customs, Western culture, Western technology, but there's also an interest in Western military capacity, military technology like firearms. This is the big thing Japan wants, especially during the Sengoku period, because European firearms are going to be kind of the reason how Japan was unified in the first place. So the desire for improved European firearms is going to be something Japan really wants from Europe, and that use of firearms is going to help unify Japan as a result of the efforts of the Oda clan. But we are also going to see European interest in Japan as well. We have European desire for Japanese art. There are at this point weeaboos, basically. I'm just kidding. That's a joke. That's not a real thing. But there is a European interest in fashion. There's a European interest in Japanese styles. There's a European interest in Japanese artistic style, but also an interest in Japanese silver. Because remember, China doesn't really want any European goods. They want silver. And if Europe can get it from the Americas, fine. That's great. But if they can also get it from Japan, even better, even closer to China, actually. So there is going to be, at first, a European presence in China, especially not only through merchants, but missionaries as well. But as you can guess in these images right here, that's going to change. So really, these European missionaries were initially designed to not only spread Catholicism, because every good Catholic wants to spread Catholicism, but also they were sent to kind of butter up Japanese elites, to get more accustomed to European merchants, to European trading presence. However, these European missionaries, these Catholic missionaries especially, are going to be met with kind of a mixed response, a mixed reaction by native Japanese people. And we do see actually a class conflict in a way. Lower class people tend to like Catholicism, they tend to like Christianity. And that's true in many societies around the world. And why is that? Well, Christianity stresses ideas of spiritual equality in the afterlife. There might be hierarchies on earth, but when we're all dead, we're all the same height, basically. We are all of the same social structure, the same social hierarchy in death. We can achieve spiritual equality in death because God only judges us based on what good deeds we did in life, in our lifetime. So if you're a good poor person, well, you're just the same as a good rich person. You're even better than a bad rich person. You get to go to heaven, they get to go to hell. So ideas of spiritual equality are appealing to peasants and poor people. But European religious ideas are appealing to Japanese merchants, not only because of this challenge to Confucian hierarchy, but also the fact that Japanese merchants want to do business with European merchants, and European merchants tend to kind of look more favorably on people with a similar religion. So people regarded as lower class, poor people, but also merchants and peasants. They also tend to gravitate towards Christianity. There will be a conversion effort that's fairly successful in Japan. About 300,000 people convert to Catholicism specifically. So there is kind of a presence of Catholicism in Japan. However, at the end of the day, who really controls society? It is elites, it is wealthy people who have military power. So we do see that elites are going to view Christianity actually with suspicion. Not only is Christianity a challenge to Confucianism, but Christianity is also the idea of a European presence in Japan. And kind of the main reason why elites are so opposed to Christianity in Japan is because if we accept European culture, that means that they will have a more big presence. They'll have a bigger presence in Japan. There is a fear that if we accept Christianity, that could lead to European colonialism, that could lead to European colonization, that could lead to taking over Japan. So we do see that kind of there is this fear and suspicion that Europeans could take over Japan. They could threaten Japanese unification. And because of this fear of European merchant presence and European Christianity becoming a subversive force in China, there will be a appeal towards isolationism, towards restricting foreigner presence within China, or excuse me, within Japan. We'll look at China later. So yes, we are going to see that isolationism will emerge largely to preserve Japanese unification, largely to diminish the presence of Europeans either as merchants or as missionaries. The missionaries especially are going to be viewed as potential threats to Japanese society. Because if we accept European religion, next thing you know, they're going to be living in our homes. Next thing you know, they're going to be using us in encomienda systems. Next thing you know, they're going to make silk plantations. So the threat of Europe is going to compel Japan to gravitate towards isolationism. And indeed, we see isolationism expressed in a lot of different policies. And kind of you can see what the policy towards Christians is going to be. They're going to outlaw Christianity, they're going to torture and execute Christian missionaries and expel them as well. So we do see that Japan will gravitate towards the idea of isolationism. You should definitely associate this term with the Tokugawa Shogunate. And there's a bit of historical criticism when it comes to using the term isolationism, because we'll look at some exceptions to that in a second, but it also has this implication that Japan is a closed off and backward society. And, we don't really like to consider societies backward, really, in our analysis of history. But we do see a restriction on foreign presence in Japan. That is something that we do see. Historians don't debate that. It is similar to the Ming Dynasty in many ways. Remember, the Ming Dynasty had this cultural idea of the Middle Kingdom, this cultural idea of haijin, of isolation, of restricting European and foreign presence in our society. And that is what is going to happen under the Tokugawa Shogunate. We are going to see under the Tokugawa Shogunate a further embrace of not only Confucian social hierarchies, but of Confucian ideas of cultural superiority, of Japanese cultural superiority to European and other foreign societies. So we do see that Confucianism will largely influence Japanese foreign policy. You could say that the influence of Confucianism is a continuity in world history, in East Asian history specifically. So let's look at some of the measures by which the Tokugawa Shogunate will maintain isolationism. Well, for one thing, give me one shake of a lamb's tail there, mein Freunds. All right. So we are going to see, for one thing, an outlawing of Christianity under the Tokugawa Shogunate. And really, again, remember, they view Christianity as a potential threat to political unity. If we accept Christianity, that means Europeans are going to come here. That means we're challenging Confucian hierarchies. So there will be an effort to outlaw Christianity. There will be mass executions of Christians. There will be an expelling of Jesuit missionaries. And we do see that there will be this appeal towards Confucianism, towards Buddhism, towards Shintoism, towards a combination of all those things, really. So outlaw Christianity. But we're also going to restrict where Japanese people themselves can go. We are going to close off Japan to the outside world. Japanese citizens can't go past Japan. They can't go into China. We'll look at exceptions of that later. But we also do see this heavy restriction of where foreigners can be in Japan. And we do see the restriction of where foreigners can live and work in Japan. We do have the system of regulating foreigner trade to a specific island in the harbor of the city of Nagasaki. Deshima is an island in the harbor of the city of Nagasaki. And this little tiny island is the only place Europeans and outside merchants can do business with Japan. So a heavy regulation of foreign presence in Japan. That's a big characterization of Japanese history, at least in this time period. And again, this was designed mostly to preserve Japanese unity, to preserve Japanese independence. We saw what went on in the Americas. We saw the conquest of the Aztec. We're seeing you now in India trying to buy up land there. That's leading to the decline of these places. We want to preserve stability. Let's restrict foreigners, basically. And really, kind of, there's actually also going to be a test. It's a little funny. Well, not funny if you're a Catholic, I guess. But there will be a test really designed to restrict these foreigners from being in Japan. And one such test actually is designed mostly to make sure there aren't any Catholics in Japan. And that is a system where European merchants had to step on a picture of the Virgin Mary, of Jesus's mom. And Catholics, obviously, pictures are a big deal. Art is a big deal for Catholics. And the Virgin Mary is a hugely important figure in Catholicism. She's like an important side character in Christianity, in Catholicism, I should say. And the only real kind of European power that can do this test, because they're not Catholic, is the Protestant Dutch. The Dutch are really the only European influence in Japan for much of its history until the 1800s. So the Dutch are going to do business in Japan. As you might have heard of in a certain video about Japanese history, there's a system of Dutch studies actually going on. But we do see that limited power of Europeans. They're restricted heavily to a specific place, a specific port. But culturally, we are seeing a change as well. We are going to see kind of the development of a more traditionalist society, one that is more focused on kind of Japanese customs as opposed to European customs. We do see the rise of a movement in Japanese history known as the Kogaku movement, the Kogaku movement. And the Kogaku movement essentially is a attempt to further reject outside influence by emphasizing Japanese traditionalism, by emphasizing Japanese native traditions like Shintoism, like Japanese interpretations of Buddhism. So we do see that there is culturally a movement that is designed to go against Westernization, is designed to go against foreign influence in Japan. And that is known as the Kogaku movement. And this is just a little demonstration of where Deshima is in Nagasaki. Deshima is the only place where Europeans and foreigners can do business in China. And again, Japan is restricting European presence, especially in China. They only want to do business with the good old Protestant Dutch. All right, so we're going to wrap up actually by looking at something. We are going to look at Japanese society and some of the kind of things that will kind of translate to future developments in the future. All right. We'll actually look at Japan in the future in Unit 7. So quite some time before we talk about them again. But we are going to build up onto that in just a second. So for one thing, it is important to understand that Japan isn't completely closed off. There is obviously the Dutch in China, in Japan, but there's also going to be kind of the Japanese authorities turning a blind eye to smuggling. Smuggling, of course, is going to happen, and it's mostly because the demand for foreign goods is still present in Japan. However, we do see that kind of this time period of the later Tokugawa Shogunate is going to have and suffer from internal economic problems, some of that associated with the restriction of trade. For one thing, we do see that kind of population growth is going to cause some internal conflict, actually. We are going to see increased population is going to lead to a lot of economic stresses. For example, we see increased demand for rice. That leads to an increased price of rice. And rice and food in general is going to increase in price in Japan. We do see Japan kind of is at a disadvantage because it's an island. Islands are limited in the space to grow food, and they're limited in where people can live. So we do see population stresses in Japan as a result of the lack of expansion, as a result of the lack of trade. Most of these smugglers are bringing in food and desired commodities from China and Europe. But we also see that this kind of class tension will not only express towards peasants and farmers and poor people, but also with samurai as well. Rice is way too expensive. So we do actually see that it's more difficult to pay samurai. Samurai are paid in rice, just for your background information. So we do see actually samurai will decline as a class of people by the 1800s, actually. The samurai begin to decline because it's just too costly to maintain them. And it's too costly to maintain them because we pay them in rice, and rice is too costly to get. You can kind of see the chain of logic there. So we are going to see that a big kind of continuity in Japanese history, especially one that will impact the 20th century, is going to be attempts to become more self-sufficient. We are going to see the government of Japan will look for ways to try and become more self-sufficient, not rely on trade with the outside world. There are going to be some attempts by the government to regulate and control trade and resource production. For example, we are going to see what are we going to see? We are going to see efforts to try and restore the forests of Japan, to regulate rice prices as well. But there is going to be a big constant problem in Japanese history of lacking natural resources. So we are going to see that that will come and bite Japan in the butt later on in history, as we'll see later. But we also do see a bit of stalling when it comes to technological development. Sure, we do have some technological exchange with the Dutch, but we do see that kind of Japan, at least during the early 1800s, is kind of lagging behind in terms of technological development. Japan is a very traditionalist, very kind of closed off to the outside world society. We do see kind of a stalling in technological progress, at least compared to Europeans. So keep that in the back of your mind, and we're going to talk about that in the future, actually. All right. So you should be able to identify how did Japan interact with Europe? How did that change over time? Think about what are some examples of things that Europe and Japan are trading before the late 1500s and what changes after the late 1500s. But you should also be able to connect this to a different region, to a different other place around the world. Think about how is the relation between Europe and Japan different from the relation between Europe and the Americas, Europe and Africa, Europe and other parts of India, Asia, namely India. All right, so that concludes today's lesson. I apologize for my runny nose. I apologize for my voice right now. Thank you. Have a grand old day. God um, is a theological concept in many monotheistic religions, including Catholicism. All right, bye.